Close your eyes and picture a pirate. I bet you see a charismatic rogue, a glint in his eye, standing confidently at the helm of a magnificent ship. He's the master of his own destiny, a rebel with a cause, living a life of thrilling adventure on the high seas. You see sword fights on sun-drenched beaches, parrots squawking on shoulders, and chests overflowing with gold and jewels. You imagine a life of absolute freedom, where the only rules are the ones you make yourself. This is the pirate of legend, the hero of 1,000 stories. This is the pirate we've been sold by movies, books, and theme park rides. A romantic figure who thumbs his nose at authority and sails off into the sunset with his treasure. It's a wonderful, exciting, and intoxicating fantasy, and it is almost entirely wrong. The truth is far grittier, far more desperate, and infinitely more brutal. The reality of being a pirate wasn't about freedom and riches. It was about survival in one of the harshest environments imaginable. So let's pull back the curtain on this popular myth. We're going to forget the swashbuckling fantasy for a little while. Instead, we'll step aboard a real pirate ship and experience the world as they truly did. It's a world less of treasure maps and more of gnawing hunger, crippling disease, and soul-crushing boredom. The story of the real pirate is not a story of adventure. It's a story of men pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, who chose a life of extreme risk because the alternative was often even worse. It was a short, violent, and miserable existence. So get comfortable. We are about to explore the brutal truth of what it really meant to be a pirate during their so-called golden age. We'll look past the legends and find the desperate, hungry, and often terrified human beings who lived and died under the Black Flag. Let's start not with a treasure map, but with the ship itself. The vessel you imagine, the Black Pearl, or the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a rare exception. Most pirate ships weren't grand galleons. They were small, stolen, and repurposed merchant vessels, chosen for speed, not comfort. These ships were not symbols of freedom. For the men crammed aboard, they were floating prisons. They were damp, dirty, and unbelievably crowded. A typical pirate sloop might be 70 feet long and packed with 80 to 100 men, leaving almost no room for personal space. And with that many people crammed into such a small, enclosed space for months on end, a single, overwhelming reality would have dominated every moment of every day. It wasn't the thrill of the chase or the fear of the Navy. It was the smell. The stench was inescapable. It was a thick, layered assault on the senses. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, of stale sweat, of rotting food, of bilge water sloshing in the hull, and of the ever-present farm animals they sometimes kept on board. And then there was the sanitation, or rather, the complete lack of it. The toilet, known as the head, was often just a grate or a series of ropes at the very front of the ship, open to the elements and the eyes of every crewmate. This lack of hygiene turned the ship into a perfect breeding ground for disease. Lice, fleas, and rats were constant companions, and illnesses like dysentery could sweep through the packed quarters with terrifying speed, incapacitating a crew far more effectively than a naval cannon. The romantic image of pirates sleeping peacefully in hammocks is also misleading. While some did, many simply found a space on the hard, damp deck, huddling together for warmth, their sleep constantly interrupted by the rolling of the ship, the shouting of orders, and the gnawing of rats. The ship was in a constant state of decay. The humid, salty air corroded everything. Wood rotted, sails tore, and ropes frayed. A huge portion of a pirate's life was not spent fighting, but engaged in the back-breaking, monotonous labor of simply keeping their vessel afloat. The constant dampness seeped into everything. Clothes were perpetually wet, bedding was moldy, and the air was thick with moisture. This led to painful skin conditions, respiratory infections, and a general sense of miserable, clammy discomfort that never, ever went away. It was a cold, wet, miserable existence. So before we even get to the fighting or the treasure, the fundamental reality of a pirate's life was this. You lived in a cramped, stinking, floating slum, surrounded by disease, decay, and discomfort. This was the stage upon which their desperate drama played out. Now, let's talk about dinner. The pirate feast we imagine, with roasted pigs and tropical fruits on a sandy beach, was a fantasy that might happen once in a career, if ever. The daily menu was a monotonous and often disgusting affair, dictated by what could survive a long voyage. The cornerstone of this diet was a food called hardtack. This was a simple biscuit made from flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked multiple times until it was as hard as a rock. It was cheap and it wouldn't spoil, which was its only virtue. Eating hardtack was a challenge. It was so dense that sailors would have to soak it in water, grog, or soup just to make it chewable. It was notorious for breaking teeth, and its bland, floury taste was the flavor of survival, not pleasure. But the hardtack itself was rarely the worst part of the meal. Because these biscuits were stored in barrels for months or even years, they almost always became infested. The true protein source in a pirate's diet often came in the form of weevils and maggots that had made their home inside the hardtack. Seasoned sailors had a grimly practical solution to this problem. They would simply eat their biscuits in the dark. What you couldn't see, you didn't have to think about. It was a simple, stomach-turning rule of survival on the high seas. The crunch you heard wasn't always the biscuit. It was the hundreds of tiny bodies living inside it. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was the accepted, everyday reality of a meal at sea. It was a choice between eating insects or starving. If the bread was full of bugs, the water was often full of slime. Fresh water was one of the most precious commodities on any ship, but it was incredibly difficult to keep clean. Stored in wooden casks for long periods, the water would quickly become stagnant and foul. Algae and green scum would grow inside the barrels, turning the water into a thick, slimy liquid that stank. Pirates would often add a ration of rum or beer to the water, creating grog, not just for the morale boost, but because the alcohol helped to kill some of the bacteria and mask the disgusting taste of the putrid water. Dehydration was a constant threat, but drinking the available water was a gamble that could easily lead to debilitating sickness, with vomiting and dysentery leaving a man too weak to work or fight. The meat situation was even more dire. While pirates might occasionally capture livestock, the main source of preserved meat was salted beef or pork, stored in barrels of brine. After months at sea, this meat would become incredibly tough and stringy, and its color would often shift to an unappetizing gray or even green. The sheer amount of salt required to preserve it made it almost inedible without extensive soaking, a luxury they couldn't always afford with their limited fresh water. Sailors would describe it as being as tough as wood, and they would often carve it into shapes or even make buttons out of it, a testament to its inedibility. This wasn't the hearty meal of a swashbuckling adventurer. It was a salty, slimy, often rancid protein source of last resort. The cumulative effect of this diet was devastating. Without fresh fruits and vegetables, pirates suffered from a host of nutritional deficiencies, the most famous of which was scurvy. Scurvy wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a horrifying and painful disease that slowly dismantled the human body. The symptoms began with lethargy and aching joints, but quickly progressed. Gums would swell, turn black, and bleed, causing teeth to loosen and fall out. Old wounds would mysteriously reopen. The skin would become bruised and blotchy. In the final stages, victims would suffer from extreme pain, fever, and eventually, a fatal hemorrhage. For a pirate, the greatest fear wasn't a naval cannonball. It was the slow, agonizing decay from within, brought on by the very food meant to sustain them. Now, let's address the most alluring part of the pirate myth: The treasure. We have this image, burned into our collective consciousness, of pirates burying chests overflowing with gold coins, silver bars, and precious jewels. The X on the map marks the spot of a life-changing fortune. The truth is that this iconic element of pirate lore is almost entirely a work of fiction, popularized by Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Treasure Island. Real pirates very rarely buried their loot. It simply didn't make any sense. A pirate's career was violent and short, and the crew wanted their share of the profits immediately, not buried on some distant island they might never see again. The treasure was meant to be spent, not saved. Furthermore, the idea of a treasure chest filled with gold and silver is a dramatic exaggeration of what pirates actually stole. While they certainly wouldn't turn down a Spanish treasure galleon, these were the rare, high-risk targets. The vast majority of ships sailing the seas were not carrying chests of gold. They were carrying mundane, practical cargo. A typical pirate haul was not jewels and doubloons, but rather barrels of flour, casks of wine, bolts of cloth, timber, sugar, tobacco, or fishing supplies. To the pirates, these goods were the real treasure. They provided food, drink, materials to repair their ship, and goods that could be easily sold or traded in friendly, often corrupt, ports. A successful raid might mean a full belly, not a full purse. The division of this treasure was surprisingly organized. Before a voyage even began, the entire crew would agree upon and sign a set of articles, the Pirate Code. This document clearly laid out the rules of the ship and, most importantly, how any loot would be divided. It was a remarkably democratic system for its time. A typical sailor would receive 1 share. The captain might receive 2 shares, while other key officers like the quartermaster or the ship's surgeon would get 1.5. This system ensured a sense of fairness and prevented the kind of disputes that could tear a crew apart. The loot was tallied and distributed as soon as possible after a capture, ensuring everyone got their due right away. Even when pirates did capture a ship carrying actual money, the payout for the average crewman was rarely enough to retire on. After dividing the spoils among 100 or more men, a single share might only amount to a few months' wages for a legitimate sailor. It was certainly more than they could earn, honestly, which was the primary appeal, but it wasn't a path to fabulous wealth. The money was often spent as quickly as it was earned, squandered on drink and revelry in pirate havens like Port Royal or Nassau. Most pirates lived a life that cycled between extreme deprivation at sea and a few weeks of wild excess on land, before they were broke again and forced to return to their brutal life. The true treasure for a pirate was not gold. It was survival and momentary escape. The most valuable things they could capture were often the most practical. Seizing a ship's medical supplies, especially the surgeon's tools, was a massive victory. Capturing a shipment of weapons and gunpowder was essential for their continued existence. Even something as simple as a good set of sails or a large quantity of rope was considered a fantastic prize, as it saved them from the dangerous and expensive task of acquiring these materials on their own. The pirate's life was not a get-rich-quick scheme. It was a desperate, high-stakes form of subsistence living, where the definition of treasure was whatever kept you alive for one more day. Let's talk about the idea of pirate freedom. The romantic notion is that a pirate ship was a lawless place, a floating republic of rebels who answered to no one. In reality, a pirate ship was one of the most rigidly controlled environments on Earth. It had to be. A vessel filled with armed, desperate men in a high-stress situation would descend into chaos and self-destruction without a strict set of rules. This is where the Pirate Code, or the ship's articles, came into play. These weren't suggestions. They were binding contracts, and the punishments for breaking them were swift and severe. This code was the glue that held the entire enterprise together, and it governed every aspect of life on board. The famous pirate Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the era, had a particularly famous and strict set of articles for his crew. His rules are a stark contrast to the chaotic image of pirate life. For example, all lights were to be out by 8 p.m. Any man who wished to drink after that hour had to do so on the open deck in the dark. Gambling with cards or dice was strictly forbidden. Musicians were to have a rest day on the Sabbath, but on all other days, they were expected to play. These rules sound less like a band of rebels and more like a strict boarding school designed to maintain order and discipline. Punishments for breaking the code were brutal and designed to be a powerful deterrent. A common punishment for minor offenses was flogging, a whipping with a cat-o'-nine tails that would leave a man's back scarred for life. For more serious crimes, such as desertion or cowardice in battle, the punishment was often death or marooning. Marooning was a particularly cruel fate. The offender would be left on a deserted island, often with nothing more than a flask of water, a small amount of gunpowder, and a pistol. It was essentially a death sentence, leaving the man to die of thirst, starvation, or by his own hand. One of the most serious crimes on a pirate ship was theft from a fellow crewmate. In a community where trust was paramount, stealing from one another was seen as the ultimate betrayal. The punishment was often a practice called slitting. The thief's nose and ears would be cut, marking them permanently as someone who could not be trusted. In other cases, they would be marooned, left to their fate. This severe response highlights how important internal cohesion was. The pirates' greatest strength was their unity against the outside world, and any threat to that unity was dealt with mercilessly. The freedom of the individual ended where the safety of the crew began. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of pirate governance was its democratic nature. While the captain held absolute authority during a battle or a chase, at all other times his power was limited. He was elected by the crew and could be removed from his position by a majority vote if they felt he was incompetent, cowardly, or unfair. The true power on the ship often lay with the quartermaster, who was also elected. The quartermaster was the crew's representative, responsible for distributing rations, maintaining order, and dividing the loot. He acted as a check on the captain's power, ensuring that the will of the crew was respected. This system was far more democratic than any naval vessel or merchant ship of the time. So the freedom of a pirate was a strange paradox. They were free from the oppressive social hierarchies and brutal discipline of the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marine. They had a say in who led them and how they were governed. But they exchanged that freedom for an equally rigid system of their own making. They were free to choose the pirate life, but once they signed the articles, they were bound by a code as strict as any law, where the penalty for failure was often a swift and violent death. Their freedom was not the absence of rules, it was the freedom to choose their own set of chains. Now, we must confront the violence. The swashbuckling sword fights of Hollywood are a ballet of choreographed action, where heroes deftly parry and riposte, emerging with little more than a scratch. The reality of combat at sea was a chaotic, terrifying, and brutally messy affair. It was less about elegant fencing and more about overwhelming the enemy with sheer, terrifying force. A pirate's primary goal was not to have a fair fight. It was to intimidate the target crew into surrendering without a fight at all. This was achieved through a strategy of psychological warfare, designed to make resistance seem like suicide. The iconic pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, was a key part of this strategy. When a pirate ship approached a target, it would often fly a friendly flag to get close. Then, at the last moment, they would hoist the black flag. This was a clear and terrifying signal. The black flag meant, "Surrender now, and we may show you mercy." If the target ship chose to resist, the pirates would then raise a red flag. The red flag had a much more chilling meaning. No quarter will be given. It was a promise that every single person on board would be killed. This threat was often enough to make a crew of merchants, who were not paid to be soldiers, immediately give up. When a battle did occur, it was a storm of noise, smoke, and splinters. The primary weapons were cannons, which were not aimed at sinking the ship, but at shredding its sails, rigging, and crew. A cannonball hitting the wooden hull of a ship would send a deadly shower of thousands of sharp, high-velocity splinters across the deck, which were often more deadly than the cannonball itself. The air would be filled with the screams of the wounded and the choking black smoke of gunpowder. It was a disorienting and hellish environment where survival was a matter of sheer luck. If the fight came to close quarters, it was not a duel of swords. Pirates used a variety of brutal and effective weapons. The cutlass was popular because its short, heavy blade was useful for slashing in the tight confines of a ship's deck. Boarding axes were used to cut through rigging and doors, as well as human flesh and bone. But the most common weapons were flintlock pistols and blunderbusses. A pirate would often carry multiple single-shot pistols, firing them once before discarding them and drawing a blade. It was a short, brutal, and panicked exchange of violence, over in minutes. The aftermath of a battle was a scene of pure horror. The deck would be slick with blood and littered with the bodies of the dead and dying. And this is where one of the most brutal truths of pirate life comes in: the medical care. There were rarely any trained doctors on board. The man responsible for treating the wounded was usually the ship's carpenter. His experience with a saw and other woodworking tools made him the most qualified person for the gruesome task of amputation. With no anesthetic other than a large quantity of rum, and no understanding of germs or sterilization, the carpenter would saw through the flesh and bone of a wounded man's limb. The procedure was excruciatingly painful, and the chances of survival were slim. To stop the bleeding, the surgeon would cauterize the wound, either by dipping the stump into a bucket of hot tar or by pressing a heated axe blade against the raw flesh. The shock and pain alone could kill a man, and even if he survived the operation, infection was almost guaranteed. A minor wound from a splinter could easily become infected and lead to a slow, agonizing death from gangrene. For a pirate, getting injured in a fight was often a death sentence, just a more drawn-out one. This was the true price of violence in their world. This brings us to the myth of the long and prosperous pirate career. In the stories, pirates like Captain Jack Sparrow seem to have been sailing the seas for decades, accumulating adventures and enemies. The reality is that the golden age of piracy itself was incredibly brief, lasting only about a decade, from roughly 1715 to 1725. And within that short period, the career of an individual pirate was even shorter. The average man who turned to piracy was lucky to survive for more than 2 or 3 years. It was a life lived at a frantic pace, because everyone knew the end was likely to be just around the corner. There were 3 primary ways a pirate's career could end, and none of them were pleasant. The first, and perhaps the most common, was death from disease or accident. As we've discussed, the appalling sanitary conditions, the terrible diet, and the constant risk of infection meant that a pirate was far more likely to be killed by a bout of dysentery or a case of scurvy than by a naval sword. Accidents were also common. In the violent chaos of a storm, a man could easily be swept overboard into the vast, empty ocean, a death sentence with no hope of rescue. Or a simple fall from the rigging could result in a fatal injury. A second leading cause of a pirate's demise was, of course, death in battle. While pirates tried to avoid a fight whenever possible, confrontations with naval vessels or heavily armed merchant ships were inevitable. These battles were savage, and the pirates were often outgunned and outnumbered. A single well-aimed cannonball could end a pirate's life in an instant. The brutal close-quarters fighting left little room for survival. For every pirate who became famous, there were thousands whose names are lost to history, their bodies simply thrown overboard after a failed attack, their brief career ending in a bloody, anonymous death. The third and most feared end for a pirate was capture. By the 1720s, the navies of the world, particularly the British Royal Navy, began a concerted effort to eradicate piracy. They sent hunter-killer ships to the Caribbean and the coast of Africa with one mission: to capture and execute pirates. When a pirate ship was captured, the crew's fate was all but sealed. They would be taken in chains to a port with an admiralty court, like Jamaica or London. The trials were swift, and the verdict was almost always guilty. There was no mercy for pirates. They were considered hostis humani generis, enemies of all mankind. The sentence was death by hanging. These were not private, dignified affairs. They were massive public spectacles, designed to be a terrifying warning to anyone else considering a life of piracy. The condemned would be paraded through the streets to the gallows, often located at a place like Execution Dock in London. Huge crowds would gather to watch the event, jeering and celebrating the demise of the feared pirates. The hanging itself was a brutal, slow death by strangulation. There was no long drop to break the neck. The victims would struggle and twitch for many minutes before finally expiring. It was a grim and humiliating end to a life of supposed freedom. But the horror did not end with death. To maximize the deterrent effect, the bodies of the most famous captured pirates were often subjected to a practice called gibbeting. After the execution, the pirate's corpse would be coated in tar to preserve it, then placed inside a custom-fitted iron cage. This cage, with the rotting body inside, would then be hung from a prominent location, usually at the entrance to a major harbor. There it would remain for years, a grotesque, decomposing scarecrow, swinging in the wind as a constant, silent warning to all sailors who passed by. This is the price of piracy. Think of the famous pirate Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach. His career, for all its fame, lasted only about 2 years. He was killed in a ferocious battle with the Royal Navy, his body found to have been shot 5 times and cut about 20 times. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of his enemy's ship. Or consider Calico Jack Rackham, famous for having 2 female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, in his crew. He was captured, tried, and hanged in Jamaica, and his body was gibbeted on a small island at the entrance to Port Royal, which is still known as Rackham's Cay to this day. This was the almost inevitable conclusion of the pirate's story. There was no retirement on a tropical island with a chest full of gold. The promise of riches and freedom was a mirage that led to one of 3 brutal ends: a slow death from disease, a violent death in battle, or a humiliating public execution. The men who chose this life were not romantic adventurers. They were desperate gamblers, wagering their short, miserable lives against the astronomically long odds of a momentary prize. The brutal truth is that, for almost every single one of them, the gamble did not pay off. Now, let's address something that often gets lost in the male-dominated narrative of piracy: the role of women. The pop culture image is usually one of 2 extremes. Either the pirate ship is a lawless fraternity, where women are absent or present only as captives, or we get the hyper-romanticized, swashbuckling female pirate who is as tough and respected as any man. As with everything else, the reality is more complex and far more interesting. Officially, women were almost universally banned from being on board a pirate ship. Many pirate codes explicitly stated that bringing a woman onto the vessel was a crime punishable by death. The reasons for this rule were grimly practical. The pirates knew that the presence of a woman on a ship full of violent, desperate men would be a source of constant conflict and jealousy. It would inevitably lead to fighting and murder, destroying the fragile unity that was essential for their survival. The rule was not about morality. It was about maintaining order and discipline. A woman on board was seen as a spark that could ignite the powder keg of the ship's social structure. Therefore, the presence of women as crew members was exceedingly rare, a massive exception to a very strict rule. This is why the stories of the few who broke this rule have become so legendary. The most famous female pirates are, without a doubt, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Their story is a fascinating glimpse into the possibilities, however slim, for women to defy the conventions of their time. Anne Bonny was an Irish woman with a fiery temper who ended up in the pirate haven of Nassau. There, she fell in love with the pirate captain Calico Jack Rackham, left her husband, and joined his crew. To hide her identity, she dressed and acted as a man, and she was reportedly as competent in a fight and as foul-mouthed as any of her male crewmates. She was not a damsel in distress. She was an active and willing participant in the pirate life. Mary Read's story is even more remarkable. She had spent most of her life disguised as a man. Her mother had dressed her as her deceased brother to secure an inheritance, and Mary continued the charade, even enlisting in the British Army. Eventually, her ship was captured by Calico Jack's crew. Still disguised as a man, she was forced to join the pirates. Her true identity was only revealed when she fell in love with another pirate on the ship and was forced to confess her secret. Anne Bonny was also on board at this time, and the two women became close friends and confidants, two of the only women in a world of violent men. The story of Bonny and Read came to an end when Calico Jack's ship was captured by pirate hunters. The legend says that at the time of the attack, most of the male crew were drunk and unable to fight. It was Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and one other man who allegedly tried to hold off the attackers. At their trial, their gender was revealed to the court, causing a sensation. They, along with the rest of the crew, were sentenced to hang. However, both women, quote, pleaded their bellies, revealing that they were pregnant. As it was against the law to execute a pregnant woman, their executions were stayed. The ultimate fate of Anne Bonny and Mary Read is a historical mystery. Mary Read died in prison shortly after the trial, likely from a fever related to childbirth. The fate of Anne Bonny is unknown. There is no record of her execution or her release. Some stories suggest her wealthy father may have paid a ransom to have her freed, and she went on to live a quiet, respectable life. We simply don't know. Her final words to her lover, Calico Jack, as he was about to be hanged, were legendarily cold. Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. Another, earlier female pirate of note was the Frenchwoman Jeanne de Clisson, known as the Lioness of Brittany. Her story is one of pure revenge. In the 14th century, her husband, a nobleman, was executed by the French king for treason. In response, Jeanne sold her lands, bought 3 warships, and painted them black with red sails. For years, she terrorized the English Channel, hunting down the ships of the French king. She would personally lead the boarding parties with an axe in hand, and her orders were to slaughter the entire crew, leaving only 1 or 2 sailors alive to return to the king and tell him what the lioness had done. These stories, while compelling, are the exceptions that prove the rule. For the vast majority of women, an encounter with pirates was a terrifying and traumatic experience. If a ship was captured, female passengers were at the mercy of the crew. While some pirate captains, like Black Bart Roberts, tried to enforce rules protecting female captives, these were often ignored in the chaos of a raid. The reality for most women was not one of empowerment and adventure, but of violence and exploitation. The pirate world was a man's world, and it was brutally hostile to any woman who found herself caught within it. Let's dive into one of the most overlooked aspects of the pirate's life: the crushing, mind-numbing boredom. The popular image is of a life of constant action, chases, battles, and shore leave, filled with raucous fun. But the sea is vast and empty. A pirate ship could spend weeks, even months, sailing back and forth along shipping lanes without spotting a single potential target. These long stretches of inactivity were a huge part of the pirate experience, and they were just as dangerous as a naval cannon. Boredom was a disease that could poison the morale of a ship and lead to infighting and mutiny. Imagine the daily routine. You wake up on a damp, hard deck. You eat your weevil-infested biscuit. Then you begin your work. This wasn't exciting work. It was endless, repetitive maintenance. You would be tasked with mending torn sails with a needle and thread, a painstaking process that took hours. You would be tarring the ropes to protect them from the salt water, a sticky, smelly, and monotonous job. You would be scrubbing the decks, pumping the bilge, and checking for leaks. Day after day, the routine was the same, all under the relentless sun, with nothing to look at but the endless, empty horizon of the ocean. To combat this soul-crushing monotony, pirates developed a few key pastimes. The first and most famous was drinking. Rum, grog, and beer were consumed in large quantities, not just to sanitize the water, but to numb the senses and pass the long, empty hours. Drunkenness was a constant state for many pirates when they were not actively engaged in sailing or fighting. However, this also led to problems. Drunken arguments could quickly escalate into deadly fights, which is why many pirate codes had strict rules about when and where drinking could occur, and why some captains, like Black Bart, tried to limit it entirely. Music was another vital escape. A pirate crew would often go to great lengths to either recruit or capture a musician. A fiddler, or a piper, was an incredibly valuable member of the crew, as their music provided a much-needed distraction from the misery and boredom of daily life. They would play jigs and reels to accompany the work and somber tunes in the evenings. The sea shanties we think of were not just for fun. They were work songs, their rhythm helping to coordinate the crew as they performed heavy, repetitive tasks like raising the anchor or hoisting the sails. Music was the soundtrack to their survival. Gambling was another popular, though often forbidden, way to pass the time. Pirates would gamble with dice or cards, betting their meager possessions or their future shares of loot. This was a dangerous pastime on a ship full of armed and often drunk men. A dispute over a game could easily lead to a knife being drawn. This is precisely why so many pirate captains banned gambling outright. They knew that in the tense, claustrophobic environment of the ship, the passions ignited by gambling could quickly tear the crew apart. The desire for a distraction was constantly at war with the need for order. Storytelling was also a crucial part of life at sea. In an age before mass media, stories were a primary form of entertainment. The crew would gather on deck during calm evenings, and the more experienced sailors would recount tales of their past adventures, of famous pirates, of monstrous sea creatures, and of faraway lands. These stories, often wildly exaggerated, were more than just entertainment. They helped to build a shared culture and identity among the crew, reinforcing the pirate legend and reminding them of the potential rewards that made their miserable existence worthwhile. They were a way of keeping the dream alive in the face of a bleak reality. This constant, grinding boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror, was the true rhythm of a pirate's life. It wasn't the non-stop action of a movie. It was a slow, difficult existence that required immense mental fortitude to endure. The psychological toll of being isolated for months on end, in a cramped and hostile environment with the constant threat of death hanging over you, was immense. The drinking, the music, the stories, these were not just pastimes. They were essential survival tools, as important as a cutlass or a pistol, for battling the inner demons of the endless, empty sea. Let's examine the very beginning of a pirate's journey. How did someone become a pirate in the first place? It was rarely a deliberate career choice made from a position of comfort. The vast majority of men who turned to piracy were driven by desperation, and they often came from the brutal worlds of the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marine. These institutions were, in many ways, just as cruel as a pirate ship, but without any of the supposed benefits of democracy or shared wealth. For many, piracy wasn't the worst option available. It was simply a different, and perhaps slightly better, kind of hell. Life in the Royal Navy was notoriously harsh. Sailors were often impressed, which was a polite term for being kidnapped off the streets, or from merchant ships, and forced into service. Once on board, they were subjected to brutal discipline. Flogging was a routine punishment for even the smallest infractions. The pay was terrible, and often months or even years in arrears. The food was just as bad as on a pirate ship, and the risk of death from disease or battle was just as high. A naval sailor had all the misery of life at sea, with none of the freedom or potential for profit that piracy offered. The merchant marine was often not much better. While the crews were volunteers, the conditions were still appalling. Captains held absolute power and could be incredibly tyrannical, doling out harsh punishments and withholding wages for flimsy reasons. Sailors were paid a pittance for enduring long, dangerous voyages. If their ship was captured by pirates, they were faced with a stark choice. They could resist and likely be killed, or they could surrender. Upon surrender, the pirates would often offer the crew of the captured vessel a chance to join them. For a man living in squalor for low pay, the offer could be surprisingly tempting. This was the most common way a pirate crew grew its numbers, by capturing sailors and forcing them to join. The word forcing is in quotes because it was often a kind of legal fiction. A sailor who could later claim he was forced into piracy had a better chance of being acquitted if he was ever captured by the authorities. In reality, many of these forced men were willing volunteers, eager to trade their miserable existence for a chance at a better life. They saw the pirates' democratic structure, the promise of a fair share of the loot, and a life free from the tyranny of naval or merchant captains, and they took the gamble. There were also those who were drawn to piracy after being left stranded and unemployed. The end of major conflicts, like the War of the Spanish Succession in 1714, was a disaster for thousands of sailors. The Royal Navy decommissioned a huge number of its ships, and thousands of trained, hardened sailors were suddenly dumped in port cities with no job and no prospects. These men had skills perfectly suited for piracy. They knew how to sail, how to fight, and how to survive at sea. For them, piracy was simply a way to continue practicing the only trade they knew, but this time for their own profit. So, the typical pirate was not a rebellious aristocrat or a romantic adventurer. He was a product of a harsh and unforgiving world. He was likely in his late 20s, poor, and hardened by years of brutal life at sea. He may have been an unemployed naval sailor, a disgruntled merchant seaman, or even an escaped indentured servant. He turned to piracy not out of a love for adventure, but out of a profound lack of better options. It was a choice made from the bottom of the social ladder, a desperate attempt to seize some small measure of wealth and autonomy in a world that offered him none. Let's consider the geography of piracy. The Golden Age wasn't a global phenomenon. It was concentrated in a few key areas where the conditions were perfect for this kind of illicit activity. These were places where major shipping lanes, carrying valuable cargo, passed close to remote islands and unpopulated coastlines that could serve as perfect pirate bases. The geography of the world created natural choke points for trade, and it was at these choke points that the pirates thrived. They were predators who understood their environment and knew exactly where to wait for their prey. The most famous of these regions was, of course, the Caribbean. The Caribbean Sea was a bustling highway for the vast wealth flowing from the Spanish colonies in the New World back to Europe. Ships laden with silver from Peru, sugar from Barbados, and tobacco from Virginia all had to pass through these waters. The area was also dotted with thousands of small, uninhabited islands, coves, and hidden bays. This provided pirates with countless places to hide, to careen their ships for repairs, to restock on fresh water, and to lie in wait for passing vessels. It was the perfect hunting ground. Pirate havens, like Nassau on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, became the epicenters of this world. For a brief period, Nassau was a true pirate republic. It was a lawless town where pirates could come to sell their stolen goods, recruit new crew members, and spend their money on drink and entertainment without fear of arrest. The corrupt or weak colonial governments had little power to stop them. These havens were essential to the pirate ecosystem. They were the logistical bases that allowed the pirates to continue their operations, a safe space to return to after the dangers of the open sea. Another major hub for piracy was the coast of West Africa, often called the Pirate Round. This route was part of the horrific triangular trade. Ships from Europe would travel to Africa carrying manufactured goods, which they would trade for enslaved Africans. These people would then be transported across the Atlantic in the infamous Middle Passage. Pirates would attack these ships at various points in their journey. They were particularly interested in the slave ships not for the human cargo, which was difficult to manage and sell, but for the valuable goods they carried, and the sturdy, fast ships themselves, which were ideal for piratical purposes. The Indian Ocean was another lucrative, though more distant, hunting ground. The pirate round also referred to a long and dangerous voyage that some pirates would undertake, sailing from the Americas, around Africa, and into the Indian Ocean. Their targets here were the fantastically wealthy ships of the Mughal Empire and the East India Companies. These vessels carried exotic goods like silk, spices, and calico, as well as pilgrims traveling to Mecca, who often carried their life savings with them. A single successful capture in the Indian Ocean could be worth more than a dozen captures in the Caribbean. A prime example of this was the pirate Henry Every. In 1695, he captured the Ganges Sawai, the flagship of the Mughal fleet. It was one of the single richest hauls in pirate history, netting a fortune in gold, silver, and jewels that was worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. The event caused a massive international incident, and the English government placed a huge bounty on Every's head, making him the most wanted man in the world. He vanished from the historical record, and his ultimate fate remains a mystery, fueling legends that he was one of the few pirates who truly managed to retire with his fortune. The success of these geographic hubs was also tied to the political climate of the time. Piracy often flourished in the wake of major wars. During wartime, governments would issue letters of marque to private ship captains, authorizing them to attack the shipping of enemy nations. These men were called privateers, and they were essentially legal, state-sanctioned pirates. When the war ended, these letters of marque were revoked. Suddenly, thousands of armed sailors and captains were unemployed, but they still had their ships and their skills. It was a very easy transition for them to simply continue what they were doing, but now for their own profit, without the sanction of any government. Ultimately, the geography that allowed piracy to flourish also contributed to its downfall. As nations began to take the threat more seriously, they used their naval power to systematically clean out these pirate havens. They established stronger military bases in the Caribbean and along the African coast. They offered pardons to pirates who were willing to give up their life of crime, which sowed division and mistrust among the pirate crews. By methodically taking away their safe havens and hunting them on the open seas, the authorities were able to strangle the pirate enterprise at its source, bringing the brief golden age to a swift and decisive end. Let's look more closely at the tools of the trade, the specific weapons and technologies that defined pirate warfare. The image of a pirate with a sword is iconic, but the cutlass was a very specific choice for a reason. A cutlass is a short, broad-bladed sword that is heavy and slightly curved. It was not a dueling weapon like a rapier. It was a brutal, practical tool. Its short length made it ideal for fighting in the incredibly cramped and crowded conditions of a ship's deck, where a longer sword would be unwieldy. Its heavy blade was powerful enough to hack through thick ropes and rigging, as well as human limbs. It was the multi-tool of pirate combat. However, the most important weapons in a pirate's arsenal were firearms. The flintlock pistol was the pirate's weapon of choice for close-quarters fighting. These were single-shot, muzzle-loading weapons that were notoriously inaccurate and slow to reload. A pirate couldn't afford to take his time reloading in the middle of a chaotic boarding action. The solution was to carry multiple pistols. A pirate would often have a brace of 2, 4, or even 6 pistols strapped to his chest on a bandolier. He would fire each one in quick succession, then drop it and draw his cutlass. It was a way of delivering a quick, shocking volley of firepower at the start of a fight. The blunderbuss was another key firearm. Essentially an early shotgun, It had a short, wide barrel that flared at the muzzle, which made it easier to load on a moving ship. It fired a spray of lead balls, nails, or scrap metal, making it devastatingly effective at clearing a deck of enemy sailors at close range. It didn't require precise aiming. The user just had to point it in the general direction of the enemy and fire. The psychological impact of a blunderbuss being leveled at a group of men was immense, making it a powerful tool of intimidation, which was always the pirate's primary goal. On a larger scale, the ship's cannons were the main instrument of battle. Pirate cannons were not primarily used to sink enemy ships. Sinking a ship meant losing its cargo, which was the entire point of the attack. Instead, pirates used a specific type of ammunition designed to cripple the ship and its crew. The first type was called chain shot. This consisted of 2 cannonballs linked together by a short length of chain. When fired, it would spin through the air like a deadly propeller, perfect for shredding the enemy's sails and rigging, rendering the ship immobile and unable to escape. Another gruesome type of ammunition was, quote, grape shot. This turned the cannon into a giant shotgun. A canvas bag was filled with dozens of small metal balls, which would then be loaded into the cannon. When fired, the bag would tear apart, sending a wide spray of deadly projectiles across the enemy's deck. This was not meant to damage the ship itself, but to maim and kill the crew, to sweep the deck of defenders before the pirates attempted to board. It was a terrifyingly effective anti-personnel weapon that contributed to the horrific number of casualties in any real sea battle. Beyond weapons, the pirates' most important tool was their ship. They favored small, fast, and agile vessels like sloops and schooners. These ships were not designed for slugging it out in a cannon duel with a naval warship. They were designed for speed and maneuverability. A pirate's strategy was to use their ship's speed to quickly overtake a slower, heavier merchant vessel, and to escape from the powerful but less nimble naval frigates that hunted them. The ship itself was a weapon, and its speed was its primary defense and its most crucial offensive advantage. One other tool was crucial to the pirate's success: fear. The Jolly Roger flag, the blood-curdling war cries, the reputation for brutality, all of this was carefully cultivated. A pirate's reputation was his most powerful weapon. If the captain and crew of a merchant vessel already believed that resistance was futile and would lead to a horrible death, they were far more likely to surrender without a fight. This meant the pirates could achieve their goal without risking their lives or damaging the precious cargo. Every act of violence and intimidation was an investment in making the next capture easier. So when we picture a pirate, we should see more than just a man with a sword. We should see a walking arsenal, a man festooned with single-shot pistols, a cutlass at his side, and perhaps a boarding axe tucked into his belt. We should see his ship not as a home, but as a weaponized platform for delivering terror. And we should understand that his greatest tool was not made of iron or wood, but was an invisible force, a carefully crafted reputation for savagery that did most of the fighting for him before a single shot was ever fired. Let's dismantle the myth of the pirate code as being a universal, honorable brotherhood of the sea. While most pirate ships did operate under a set of articles, these were not standardized across the pirate world. Each crew's code was a unique contract, a bespoke set of rules drafted and agreed upon for a specific voyage and a specific group of men. There was no grand overarching pirate legislature. The code of Black Bart Roberts, with its strict curfew and ban on gambling, would have been laughed at on the ship of a more hedonistic captain like Charles Vane. The code was a practical tool, not a moral philosophy. The primary purpose of the pirate code was not honor, but risk management. It was a business contract for a criminal enterprise. The article's main function was to mitigate the 3 biggest threats to the voyage's success: disputes over money, internal conflict, and failure in battle. The detailed breakdown of how loot would be shared was designed to prevent arguments after a successful capture. The strict punishments for fighting on board or stealing from a crewmate were there to maintain discipline. and the promise of compensation for injuries sustained in battle was a powerful incentive for men to be brave when it mattered most. This compensation system was one of the most remarkable features of many pirate codes. It was essentially an early form of workers' compensation or disability insurance. The articles would specify set payments for specific injuries. For instance, a man might receive 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right leg, 500 for the loss of a left leg, and 100 for the loss of an eye or a finger. This was a guarantee that if a man was maimed in service to the crew and could no longer work as a sailor, he would not be cast aside and left to starve. He would receive a lump sum payment from the ship's next prize before the rest of the loot was even divided. This system was a powerful recruiting tool. A sailor in the Royal Navy who lost a leg in the service of the king would be lucky to get a small pension, if anything at all. He would likely end up as a beggar. A pirate, however, was guaranteed a substantial payout, a small fortune that could allow him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. This promise made the incredible risks of a pirate battle seem much more palatable. It transformed the crew from a group of individuals into a collective, where the group insured its members against the inherent dangers of their profession. The democratic nature of the code, with the election of the captain and quartermaster, was also born of pure pragmatism. These men were hardened, cynical sailors who had likely suffered under the lash of tyrannical captains in the Navy or merchant service. They had no interest in creating another dictatorship. They knew that a captain who had the full support and trust of his crew would be a more effective leader. And they knew that giving the crew the power to remove a captain they deemed incompetent or cowardly was a vital quality control measure that could save all of their lives. So, while we can admire the surprisingly progressive and democratic elements of the Pirate Code, we shouldn't romanticize it as a document of high-minded ideals. It was a brutally practical social contract, forged in the crucible of desperation and greed. It was the operating system for a floating criminal organization. The rules were not about being, quote, honorable thieves. They were about creating a stable and efficient business model for robbery on the high seas. The code was the law in a lawless world, but it was a law written to maximize profit and minimize the risk of self-destruction. Let's consider the end of the Golden Age and why it collapsed so quickly. For about a decade, pirates seemed to be an unstoppable force in the Atlantic world, but by 1726, the threat had been all but extinguished. This rapid decline was not an accident. It was the result of a concerted and multi-pronged campaign by the very powers the pirates had been preying on. The governments of Europe, particularly Great Britain, finally decided that the disruption to trade caused by piracy was too costly to tolerate, and they brought the full weight of their national power to bear on the problem. The first and most crucial step was the use of overwhelming naval force. The Royal Navy, no longer occupied with major wars, was able to dedicate powerful warships specifically to hunting pirates. These were not clumsy galleons. They were fast frigates and sloops of war, captained by men like Woodes Rogers, a former privateer who knew exactly how pirates thought and operated. They patrolled the key shipping lanes and, most importantly, went directly to the source, attacking the pirate havens like Nassau. By destroying their safe harbors, the Navy denied pirates a place to rest, repair, and sell their goods, making them fugitives on the open sea. The second tool was legal and political pressure. The British government began to put immense pressure on colonial governors to crack down on piracy. For years, corrupt officials in places like North Carolina or Jamaica had been turning a blind eye to piracy, often taking bribes in exchange for offering pirates a safe market for their stolen goods. The Crown made it clear that this tolerance would no longer be accepted. Governors who colluded with pirates were removed from office, and new, more aggressive administrators were put in their place, armed with the authority to establish admiralty courts that could try and execute pirates on the spot. The third, and perhaps most clever tactic, was the King's Pardon of 1717. King George I issued a royal proclamation offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered to the authorities by a certain deadline. This offer was incredibly divisive. For many pirates who were tired of the brutal and dangerous life, it was an irresistible chance to escape the gallows and reintegrate into society. For the more hardline pirates, it was a sign of weakness. The pardon sowed deep mistrust within the pirate ranks. Crews began to fall apart as men argued over whether to accept the offer. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare that broke the unity of the pirate brotherhood. The combination of these three strategies, military force, legal crackdown, and the offer of a pardon, was devastatingly effective. The pirates' business model was systematically dismantled. Their safe havens were destroyed. The markets for their goods were closed. Their numbers were thinned by naval attacks and by those who accepted the pardon. The remaining pirates found themselves isolated, hunted, and with nowhere to run. The Golden Age ended not with a bang, but with a tightening noose. The world that had allowed piracy to flourish had changed, and the pirates were unable to adapt. The final nail in the coffin was the public's changing perception. During the height of the Golden Age, some members of the public in Britain and the American colonies had a certain romantic sympathy for pirates, seeing them as rebels against the oppressive and wealthy merchant class. But as the stories of pirate brutality became more widespread, and as the economic damage mounted, this sympathy evaporated. The execution of famous pirates became popular public spectacles. The pirate transformed from a folk hero into a villain, an enemy of all civilized people. Without any popular support, their fate was sealed. So the brutal truth of the pirates' end is that they were not defeated by a single hero or in one climactic battle. They were crushed by the slow, methodical, and overwhelming power of the modern state. They were a relic of a more chaotic time, and they could not survive in a world where nations were becoming more organized, more bureaucratic, and more ruthlessly efficient at protecting their economic interests. The pirate was an entrepreneur of violence, but he could not compete with the ultimate monopoly on violence, the national government. The Golden Age was a brief, fiery rebellion that was inevitably extinguished by the forces of order. We've journeyed through the filth, the fear, and the futility of the real pirate's life. We've seen that the ship was a floating prison, the food was a source of disease, and the treasure was usually just mundane cargo. We've learned that their freedom was a paradox, their violence was messy and grim, and their careers were brutally short, almost always ending at the end of a rope. The romantic image of the swashbuckling adventurer simply cannot withstand the harsh light of reality. The life of a pirate was a life of last resort. So why does the myth persist so strongly? Why do we still, after all this, want to believe in the charismatic rogue with the treasure map? Perhaps it's because the myth serves a purpose that the reality cannot. The fantasy of the pirate is a fantasy of ultimate freedom. It's the dream of escaping the rules, the bosses, the monotony of modern life, and sailing off to a world where you are the master of your own fate. It's a powerful and alluring dream, and it's far more pleasant to think about than the grim alternative we've explored. The pirate myth allows us to project our own desires for rebellion and autonomy onto a historical figure. We strip away the scurvy, the stench, and the constant terror, and we are left with a pure symbol of defiance. This sanitized version of the pirate is not a desperate criminal. He is a hero of individuality, a man who lives by his own code in a world that tries to crush him. It's a story we tell ourselves because we need to believe that such a life is possible, even if it's only in our imagination. The truth is that the men who lived this life were not thinking about legacy or symbolism. They were thinking about their next meal, about surviving the next storm, about avoiding the noose for just one more day. They were trapped in a cycle of violence and desperation, and their choices were born of a profound lack of other options. They were the dispossessed, the forgotten, the human refuse of a rapidly expanding global economy, and they lashed out in the only way they knew how. To truly understand the pirate, we must hold both of these images in our minds at once. We must see the desperate, starving sailor eating weevils in the dark, and we must also understand the powerful symbol of freedom that he would later become. The gap between the brutal reality and the romantic myth is where the true story of the pirate lies. It's the story of how history transforms the grim and desperate struggles of real people into the entertaining legends we consume today. The next time you see a pirate in a movie, with his witty remarks and his daring escapes, perhaps you'll see him a little differently. Perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of the terrified, hungry, and exhausted man behind the fantasy. You'll remember the stench of the ship, the taste of the hardtack, and the ever-present shadow of the gallows. The real pirate story is not a fun adventure. It is a cautionary tale, a human tragedy played out on the vast and indifferent stage of the sea. And in the end, that is the most brutal truth of all. The real curse of the pirate wasn't a chest of haunted Aztec gold or a mythical sea creature. The real curse was simply being a pirate. It was a life that promised everything: wealth, freedom, glory. But in reality, for almost everyone who lived it, it delivered nothing but a short, miserable journey to a violent and anonymous end. The legend is a lie, but it's a lie we choose to remember, because the truth is too grim to be an adventure. The wooden world of the pirate ship was a microcosm of extreme human experience. Let's delve deeper into the psychological state of these men. Imagine being cut off from the entire world for months. Your only reality is the creaking wood beneath your feet, the vast, empty sky above, and the faces of the same 100 men. This isolation would have been profound. It creates a powerful us versus them mentality. The entire world, with its laws and navies, becomes the enemy. Your only loyalty is to the men who share your miserable existence, because they are the only ones who understand. This intense bonding, born of shared hardship, is why the betrayal of stealing from a crewmate was punished so severely. It wasn't just a theft of property. It was a rupture in the very fabric of their survival. On a pirate ship, your crewmate was the man who would hold the line with you in a battle, who would help you mend the sails in a storm, who would share his meager ration of water. To steal from him was to declare that you valued your own self-interest above the survival of the group. In such a dangerous world, that was a form of treason that could not be tolerated. Consider also the role of superstition. In a world governed by the unpredictable whims of the wind, the weather, and sheer luck, sailors have always been a superstitious lot. Pirates were no exception. They had a whole host of beliefs and omens that governed their lives. Whistling on board a ship was thought to whistle up a storm and was often forbidden. Seeing a cormorant or a dolphin was considered a good omen. Having a woman on board was, for many, considered profoundly bad luck, a belief that reinforced the practical reasons for banning them. These superstitions were a way of trying to impose some sense of control and order on a chaotic and uncontrollable world. The fear of the unknown was a constant companion. The maps of the 18th century still had vast, blank spaces, marked with phrases like, "Here be dragons." Sailors would tell tales of monstrous krakens that could pull entire ships down to the depths, of beautiful but deadly mermaids, and of ghost ships like the Flying Dutchman, crewed by the damned and doomed to sail the seas for eternity. For a pirate, alone on the dark ocean at night, these stories were not just fun tales, they were terrifying possibilities. The natural dangers of their life were bad enough, but the supernatural dangers were a source of constant psychological dread. Let's revisit the concept of the ship's surgeon, who was often the carpenter. The tools he used for amputation were the same tools he used for woodworking. The saw for cutting a man's leg was the same saw used to cut a plank of wood. There was no concept of sterilization. The saw would be covered in sawdust, tar, and the blood of the last man it was used on. The surgeon would often prepare for the operation by getting both himself and the patient as drunk as possible. The sheer brutality of this medical reality is hard to comprehend. It underscores the cheapness of life in their world. After an amputation, the severed limb would simply be thrown overboard. The crew would watch as the bloody limb disappeared into the waves, a grim reminder of their own mortality. If the man survived the initial shock and blood loss, he would then face the agony of healing. With infection almost certain, the stump would swell, fester, and fill with pus. The pain would be constant and unbearable. The only relief was more alcohol or laudanum, an opium tincture, if they were lucky enough to have captured some. Surviving an injury was often a worse fate than dying quickly in battle. Let's consider the concept of careening. A ship's hull, constantly in the water, would become covered in barnacles and shipworms. The barnacles would slow the ship down, and the shipworms would bore into the wooden planks, eventually destroying the hull. To fix this, pirates had to perform a maneuver called careening. They would find a deserted beach, run the ship aground at high tide, and then use ropes and pulleys to pull the ship over onto its side, exposing one half of the hull. They would then have to scrape off all the growth and recoat the hull in a mixture of tar and sulfur to protect it. This was an incredibly vulnerable time for a pirate crew. Their ship was beached and helpless. Their cannons were often removed to lighten the load. If a naval vessel discovered them in this state, they would be completely defenseless. The work itself was backbreaking, done under a hot tropical sun, often in swarms of insects. It could take weeks to complete. This period of forced inactivity and high vulnerability was one of the most stressful parts of a pirate's life, a necessary chore that put them at extreme risk. Think about the sounds of a wooden ship at sea. It was not a quiet place. It was a symphony of constant noise. The creaking and groaning of the wooden timbers as the ship flexed in the waves, the snapping and flapping of the sails in the wind, the constant sloshing of water in the bilge, the shouts of the officers giving orders, the bleating of goats or squawking of chickens kept for food, and underneath it all, the scurrying and squeaking of hundreds, if not thousands of rats. There was no silence, no peace. It was a perpetual assault on the ears, adding to the psychological stress of the voyage. The diet had other, more insidious effects beyond scurvy. The lack of variety and the constant consumption of salted, preserved foods would have led to chronic digestive problems. The constant threat of food poisoning and dysentery was ever present. The physical discomfort would have been a constant companion, a low-level misery that ground a man down day by day. This physical malaise would have contributed to the short tempers and violent outbursts that were so common on pirate ships. It's hard to be patient and reasonable when you are in a state of constant physical discomfort. Let's talk about the pirates' relationship with the law. They were outlaws, but they existed in a complex gray area. In the early days, colonial governors often unofficially supported pirates because they brought much-needed gold and silver into their local economies. A pirate ship sailing into port was like a stimulus package. They spent lavishly, and the local tavern owners, merchants, and artisans all benefited. This is why places like Port Royal in Jamaica became known as the Sodom of the New World. For a time, the pirates were a key part of the local economy, and the authorities were willing to look the other way. This symbiotic relationship eventually broke down as the pirates became more powerful and brazen, and as the British government exerted more control. The pirates who had once been tolerated business partners were rebranded as a threat to international trade and order. The very same governors who had once welcomed them were now ordered to hunt them down. For the pirates, this must have felt like a profound betrayal. The system that had once tacitly encouraged them was now ruthlessly dedicated to their destruction. This shift helps explain the escalating violence and bitterness of the later years of the Golden Age. Consider the ages of these men. The popular image is often of older, grizzled veterans of the sea. While there were certainly some of those, the average pirate was quite young. Most were in their 20s. This was a young man's game, requiring physical strength and a willingness to take extreme risks. A ship full of 100 young, armed, and often drunk men is a volatile combination. Their youth and inexperience may have contributed to their recklessness, and their belief that they were invincible, a belief that was usually shattered very quickly. The end of a pirate's life, the hanging at Execution Dock, was a carefully stage-managed piece of state theater. The gallows themselves were often set up on the low-tide line of the Thames River. This was symbolic. Pirates committed their crimes on the sea, within the jurisdiction of the Admiralty, so they were executed within that same jurisdiction. The fact that the gallows would be submerged at high tide was a powerful symbol of the sea washing away the stain of their crimes. The entire process was designed to reinforce the power and reach of the state. We should also remember that our knowledge of pirates comes from very biased sources. Most of what we know was written by their enemies, the naval officers who hunted them, the government officials who tried them, and the captured merchants who were their victims. The most famous book about them, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, was published in 1724 under the pseudonym Captain Charles Johnson. While it's our best source of information, it was written to be a sensationalist bestseller, likely exaggerating the most lurid and violent details to appeal to a public hungry for shocking stories. The pirates themselves left very few written records. History is written by the victors, and in this case, the victors were the ones with the rope. Let's explore the mundane reality of what happened immediately after a ship was captured. The first priority was to control the captured crew and secure the vessel. The pirates would round up the sailors, often using threats and intimidation to ensure compliance. The ship would be thoroughly searched, not just for valuables, but for anything useful: food, water, rope, sailcloth, weapons, and medical supplies. The ship's log and papers would be examined to determine where it had come from and where it was going, which could provide valuable intelligence about other potential targets in the area. The fate of the captured crew varied greatly. If they had surrendered without a fight, they were usually treated relatively well. The pirates might rob them of their valuables and some of their clothing, but they would often be left unharmed. As we discussed, the pirates would then offer the crew the chance to join them. Skilled craftsmen, like carpenters, surgeons, or musicians, were particularly valuable and would be strongly encouraged to sign the articles. Those who refused would be left on the captured ship, or sometimes put ashore if they were near land. However, if the crew had resisted, their fate could be much grimmer. The pirates, fueled by the adrenaline of battle and having likely suffered casualties themselves, would be in no mood for mercy. The captured sailors could be beaten, tortured, to reveal the location of hidden valuables, or simply murdered outright. The captain and officers of the captured ship were often treated with particular contempt, as they were seen as symbols of the tyrannical authority the pirates had rebelled against. It was not uncommon for a hated captain to be tortured or killed by his own former crew, who were now free to exact their revenge under the protection of the pirates. The captured ship itself was a valuable prize. If it was a better vessel than the pirates' own ship, faster, more heavily armed, or in better condition, they would simply abandon their old ship and make the new one their flagship. This is how many pirates upgraded their vessels over time. If the captured ship was not an upgrade, they would strip it of everything of value. They would take its cannons, its sails, its anchors, its food stores, and any cargo that could be easily sold. After it was looted, the empty hulk might be burned or simply set adrift, a ghost ship left to its fate. The process of dividing the loot was methodical. The quartermaster would take charge, meticulously cataloging every item of value. The total worth would be estimated, and then the shares would be calculated according to the articles. The compensation for the wounded would be paid out first. Then the remaining loot would be distributed, with each man receiving his allotted portion. This was a moment of rare celebration and satisfaction in a life of hardship. For a brief time they were rich, but this wealth was fleeting, and the cycle of poverty and violence would soon begin again. The pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, deserves a closer look. It was not a single, standardized design. Each famous pirate captain had his own unique flag, a personal brand that was designed to strike fear into the hearts of their victims. Blackbeard's flag famously depicted a skeleton spearing a bleeding heart while toasting the devil. Bartholomew Roberts had a flag showing him standing on two skulls, one labeled ABH, a Barbadian's head, and the other AMH, a Martiniquean's head, signifying his grudge against the governors of those two islands who had tried to hunt him down. The symbolism of the Jolly Roger was powerful and universal. The skull and crossbones was a well-known symbol of death, the memento mori. The black background represented the void, the absence of life. An hourglass symbolized that the victim's time was running out. A bleeding heart signified a slow and painful death. A spear or a dagger represented violence. These flags were a form of visual communication, a clear and unambiguous message that could be understood by sailors of any nationality, regardless of language. The message was simple: surrender or die. The name Jolly Roger itself is a mystery. One theory is that it comes from the French phrase Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, which referred to the red flag that signified no quarter. Another theory suggests it might be a corruption of Old Roger, a nickname for the devil. Whatever its origin, the name itself is a perfect example of pirate irony, a cheerful, friendly name for a symbol of pure terror. It captures the gallows humor that was so essential for surviving in their brutal world. Let's focus on the human cost for the victims. We often forget that for every successful pirate raid, there was a ship full of innocent sailors and passengers whose lives were turned upside down. These were ordinary people, trying to make a living or travel to a new home. An encounter with pirates was a deeply traumatic event. They would lose their possessions, their livelihood, and sometimes their lives. Even if they survived, they would be left with the psychological scars of the encounter for the rest of their days. The pirate's story of rebellion was the victim's story of terror. Consider the economic impact. Piracy was not just a series of isolated robberies. It was a major disruption to the emerging global economy. It raised insurance rates for shipping, making all imported goods more expensive. It discouraged merchants from investing in certain trade routes, slowing economic development. It was a major source of political friction between nations, who often blamed each other for not doing enough to control the pirates operating from their colonies. The eradication of piracy was not just a matter of law and order. It was an economic necessity for the powerful trading nations of Europe. What about the idea of a pirate accent? The air, and shiver me timbers that we associate with pirates is a complete fabrication. It has no basis in historical reality. This accent was invented for the 1950 Disney movie Treasure Island. The actor Robert Newton, who played Long John Silver, was from the West Country of England. He used his native Dorset accent for the role, and he exaggerated it for dramatic effect. His performance was so iconic that it single-handedly created the pirate accent that we all know today. Real pirates came from all over the world: England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the American colonies, Africa, and beyond. They would have spoken with a wide variety of accents. Similarly, the idea of pirates wearing an eye patch is largely a myth. While a pirate could certainly lose an eye in a fight, the idea that it was a common accessory is not supported by evidence. There is a modern theory that pirates might have worn an eye patch to keep one eye constantly adapted to the dark so they could see below decks in a fight. While this is a clever idea, there is no historical evidence to support it. More likely, the eye patch, like the parrot and the peg leg, became part of the pirate costume because of the enduring influence of fictional stories like Treasure Island. A peg leg is another classic element of the pirate image. This, at least, has some basis in reality. Given the brutal nature of combat and the primitive medical care, losing a limb was a real possibility. A crude wooden peg leg was a common form of prosthesis for anyone, sailor or not, who had lost a leg in this era. However, it was not exclusively a pirate accessory. A man with a peg leg would have been severely hampered in his ability to perform the demanding physical labor required on a ship, such as climbing the rigging. A one-legged pirate would have been a liability, and likely would not have been able to continue the active life of a pirate for long. The parrot on the shoulder is, again, almost entirely due to Long John Silver's parrot, Captain Flint, in Treasure Island. While sailors in this period did sometimes keep pets on board to combat loneliness and boredom, and these could have included exotic birds picked up in their travels, there is no special historical connection between pirates and parrots. A noisy, squawking parrot would have been a poor choice for a crew that relied on stealth to approach its victims. Like so many other elements of the myth, it's a piece of fictional color that has become accepted as historical fact. Let's consider the concept of honor among thieves. Was there truly a sense of honor that governed pirate behavior? It's a complicated question. On one hand, the pirate code represented a form of internal, contractual honor. A pirate was expected to be loyal to his crew, to be brave in battle, and to respect the agreed-upon division of loot. Betraying this internal code was a cardinal sin. On the other hand, they had no sense of honor towards the outside world. They were thieves and murderers who preyed on innocent people. Their honor was a limited and self-serving concept, designed to ensure the smooth operation of their criminal enterprise, not to adhere to any higher moral principle. The pirates' relationship with alcohol was deeply complex. Rum was called the bottle of courage and was often drunk before a battle to steady the nerves. It was a social lubricant, a medicine, an anesthetic, and an escape from boredom. However, it was also a source of immense danger. Drunkenness led to carelessness, accidents, and violent fights. A drunken lookout could fail to spot an approaching naval vessel, dooming the entire crew. This is why the more successful and disciplined pirate captains, like Black Bart Roberts, tried to control or even ban its consumption. They recognized that the very thing that made the life bearable was also one of the biggest threats to their survival. The physical appearance of a pirate was likely very different from the romantic image. They were not dashingly handsome men in fine clothes. Their clothing would have been practical, durable, and often ragged. They would wear loose-fitting breeches and simple shirts, practical for the hard work of sailing. Their skin would be weathered and burned by the sun and the wind. Many would be scarred from fights and diseases. Their teeth, if they had any left, would be rotten from poor nutrition and scurvy. They were not attractive figures. They were hardened, weather-beaten men who bore the physical marks of their brutal lifestyle. The idea of walking the plank is another enduring myth. Like the pirate accent, it was largely popularized by fiction, particularly in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. There are very few, if any, reliable historical accounts of pirates forcing their victims to walk the plank. It was an overly elaborate and time-consuming method of execution. A real pirate, if he wanted to kill a captive, would have done so in a much more direct and efficient manner, with a pistol shot, a cutlass blow, or simply by throwing them overboard. The plank is a theatrical invention, a dramatic device that has little to do with historical reality. So we have peeled back layer after layer of myth. The accent, the eye patch, the parrot, walking the plank, the buried treasure. All of these iconic elements are largely the product of fiction, created long after the Golden Age had ended. They were invented by storytellers who were trying to create a compelling and romantic narrative, not to accurately document history. The reality was a world of pain, filth, and desperation. It was a world of rotten teeth, not witty remarks, of agonizing disease, not thrilling adventures, and of crushing poverty, not chests of gold. Let's pause and consider the sheer physical strength and endurance required to be a pirate. In an age before machines, everything on a ship was powered by muscle. Hoisting a heavy sail required a team of men pulling on thick, coarse ropes in perfect coordination. Raising the anchor was an exhausting task that could take hours of backbreaking labor at the capstan. In a storm, the men would have to climb high into the rigging, on slippery, swaying ropes, to furl the heavy, wet canvas sails, all while being lashed by wind and rain. It was one of the most physically demanding jobs in the world. The knowledge required was also immense. A good sailor had to be an expert in a dozen different trades. He had to know how to read the wind and the weather. He had to know the hundreds of different ropes on the ship by name and function. He had to be an expert in tying a huge variety of complex knots, each with a specific purpose. He had to know how to navigate by the sun and the stars. He had to be able to patch a sail, repair a leak, and load and fire a cannon. This was not a job for the unskilled. These were highly skilled professionals, whose expertise was a matter of life and death every single day. The pirates' greatest enemy was not the Royal Navy. It was the sea itself. A hurricane could appear with little warning, and it could tear a sturdy ship to pieces in a matter of hours. The waves could grow to the size of mountains, and the wind could snap a mast like a twig. In a major storm, the crew would be engaged in a desperate battle for survival against the raw power of nature. They would be working for days without sleep, soaked to the bone, fighting to keep the ship from being swamped. Many a pirate vessel, with all its crew and any treasure it might have had, simply sailed into a storm and was never seen again, its fate unknown. Let's consider the concept of justice among pirates. What happened when a pirate was accused of a crime by his crewmates? The trial was often conducted by the quartermaster, acting as a sort of judge, with the entire crew serving as the jury. Both the accuser and the accused would be given a chance to state their case. The crew would then vote on the verdict. This form of direct democracy was at the heart of the pirate social contract. It ensured that punishments were seen as fair and legitimate by the community, rather than as the arbitrary whim of a single leader. One of the most famous forms of pirate justice was the duel. If two pirates had a serious quarrel that could not be resolved, they might be allowed to settle it with a duel. However, to prevent the loss of valuable crewmen, these duels were often highly ritualized. The two men might be put ashore on a small island or a sandbar, given a pistol and a single shot, and made to fight it out there. This was called marooning for a cause. It resolved the dispute while keeping the violence away from the close quarters of the ship, where it could escalate and endanger everyone. The diversity of a pirate crew is something often overlooked. Because they recruited from the crews of captured ships from all over the world, a single pirate vessel could be an incredibly cosmopolitan place. A crew might include Englishmen, Scotsmen, Irishmen, Welshmen, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Swedes, and a significant number of men of African descent. In the hierarchical and racist world of the 18th century, a pirate ship was one of the few places where a black man could be treated with a degree of equality. If he was a skilled sailor and a brave fighter, he could earn a full share of the loot and have a say in the ship's governance, a level of freedom and status that was unthinkable on land. Some men of African descent even rose to positions of leadership. One of Blackbeard's most trusted lieutenants, Black Caesar, was a former African chieftain who had been captured by slavers. He escaped and became a formidable pirate in his own right, before eventually joining forces with Blackbeard. While the pirates were certainly not enlightened social reformers, their pragmatic need for skilled and loyal crewmen often overrode the racial prejudices of the time. They were equal opportunity criminals, where a man's worth was judged by his skills and his courage, not the color of his skin. Let's revisit the food from a different angle, the occasional feast. While daily life was a struggle for sustenance, there were rare moments of gluttony. If the pirates captured a ship carrying livestock, or if they landed on an island teeming with wild pigs or turtles, they would seize the opportunity for a feast. The most famous food source for pirates in the Caribbean was the sea turtle. They were plentiful, easy to catch, and one large turtle could feed a crew for days. The pirates would cook the turtle meat in its own shell, creating a massive stew called callipee. These rare feasts were moments of pure joy and relief, a brief respite from the daily grind of hardtack and salted meat. The legacy of the pirates is a strange and contradictory one. In their own time, they were reviled as the enemies of civilization. But in the centuries since, they have been transformed into romantic heroes. Why this transformation? It began in the 19th century, with writers like Lord Byron, who romanticized the idea of the, quote, noble outlaw. This was cemented by Treasure Island, which created the template for the adventure story that we still love today. The pirates of the Golden Age were the perfect raw material for these stories. They were rebels, they were exotic, and they were conveniently long dead, so their real-world brutality could be safely ignored. In a way, the pirates have achieved a kind of immortality that would have been unimaginable to them. These poor, desperate, and often illiterate men, who lived and died in obscurity, have become some of the most famous and recognizable figures in popular culture. Their brief, violent lives have been sanitized and repackaged as entertainment for generations of people living in a world of comfort and safety that would have been alien to them. The brutal truth of their existence has been almost entirely replaced by a comfortable and exciting lie. The real pirates of the Golden Age were a symptom of a sick system. They were the desperate byproduct of imperial wars, brutal naval discipline, and the horrific institution of the slave trade. They were men who were chewed up and spat out by the engines of empire, and who decided to fight back in the only way they could. Their rebellion was not noble or heroic. It was savage, self-interested, and ultimately doomed. But it was a rebellion nonetheless. It was a brief, violent, and chaotic scream of rage against a world that had no place for them. So, the next time you hear a child shout, "Arr!" or see a skull and crossbones flag on a toy, remember the reality behind it. Remember the stench, the fear, the disease, and the desperation. Remember the men who signed their lives away for a slim chance at a slightly better existence. The truth about being a pirate is not a fun story of adventure. It's a dark and complex story about poverty, violence, and the human cost of empire. And like most history, it is far more fascinating and far more tragic than the myths we have built on top of it. Let's consider the pirates' navigation skills. In an era without GPS, they had to rely on celestial navigation, using tools like the sextant and the astrolabe to measure the angle of the sun and stars above the horizon. This required complex mathematical calculations to determine their latitude. Determining longitude, their east-west position, was even more difficult and was largely a matter of guesswork and dead reckoning, which involved estimating your position based on your course and speed. A small error in calculation could lead a ship hundreds of miles off course, into deadly reefs or the empty expanse of the open ocean. The role of the ship's carpenter, beyond his gruesome surgical duties, was absolutely vital. A wooden ship was a complex machine that was constantly in need of repair. The carpenter was responsible for plugging leaks, repairing damage from storms or battles, and even reshaping the ship's structure if needed. He was one of the most skilled and indispensable members of the crew. His ability to keep the ship afloat was the foundation upon which all of their criminal activities rested. A good carpenter was worth more than a dozen good fighters. The clothing pirates wore had to be incredibly durable. They would often wear canvas or linen, materials that could withstand the constant friction and strain of working on a ship. They would often coat their clothes and hats in tar to make them waterproof, a practical but smelly solution to the constant dampness. The image of pirates wearing flamboyant, stolen finery is misleading. While they might have dressed up in captured clothes for a wild party in port, their daily working attire was all about function over fashion. Let's think about the life of a pirate who was lucky enough to survive and accept a pardon. His life would not have been easy. He would carry the stigma of his past forever. He would be watched with suspicion by his neighbors and by the authorities. Many former pirates found it difficult to readjust to a life of honest, low-paid labor after having a taste of the wealth and freedom of their former lives. Some would inevitably return to piracy, unable or unwilling to live within the confines of the law. For many, the pardon was not a happy ending, but simply a different kind of prison. The pirates' diet lacked vitamin C, causing scurvy, but it also lacked many other essential nutrients. A diet of hardtack and salted meat was severely deficient in vitamins A, D, and B complex. This would have led to a host of health problems, including night blindness, weakened bones, and neurological issues. The pirates were not just sick, they were chronically malnourished, operating in a state of physical degradation that made them more susceptible to every other danger they faced. The psychological impact of their constant proximity to death cannot be overstated. Every day they faced the risk of death from storms, disease, starvation, accidents, or violence. This would have fostered a sense of fatalism, a belief that life was short and unpredictable, so you might as well live for the moment. This live fast, die young mentality helps to explain their reckless behavior, their heavy drinking, and their tendency to squander their loot as soon as they got it. Why save for a future you will probably never see? What about the legal status of their stolen goods? When pirates brought their loot to a port, they couldn't just sell it in the open market. They had to rely on a network of fences and corrupt merchants who were willing to buy stolen goods at a steep discount. This meant that the pirates rarely got the full value for their cargo. The middlemen who took the risk of trading with them took a huge cut of the profits. This is another reason why the average pirate rarely got rich. The entire criminal ecosystem was designed to funnel wealth upwards, away from the men who were actually taking the risks. Let's consider the names that pirates used. Many adopted aliases or nicknames like Blackbeard, Calico Jack, or Black Bart. This served a practical purpose. It helped to obscure their true identity, making it harder for the authorities to track them down or to bring repercussions against their families back home. It also helped to build their personal brand and their fearsome reputation. A name like Blackbeard was far more intimidating than Edward Teach. It was part of the theater of terror that was central to their success. The language of the sea was a highly specialized jargon. A ship had its own vocabulary for every rope, every sail, and every maneuver. A landlubber, someone unfamiliar with this language, would be completely lost. This specialized language created a strong sense of identity and exclusivity among sailors. It was a sign that you belonged to their world. For pirates, the shared language helped to unify their diverse crews, creating a common culture that transcended their different nationalities and backgrounds. The heat of the tropics, where most pirates operated, was a relentless and oppressive force. The sun would beat down on the deck, making the air thick and heavy. Below decks, the air was stagnant and oven-like. This intense heat would have made the already grueling physical labor even more exhausting. It would have also accelerated the spoilage of food and water, contributing to the constant threat of disease. The beautiful tropical paradise we imagine was, for the men working on these ships, often a sweltering, humid hell. Let's consider the ship's rats. They were a constant and unavoidable presence. They would get into the food stores, contaminating them with their droppings. They would gnaw on the ropes and sails, causing damage to the ship. They carried fleas that could transmit diseases like the plague. At night, they would scurry over the sleeping sailors. The battle against the rat infestation was a constant and losing one. For the men on board, the rats were a symbol of the filth and decay that defined their existence. The end of the Golden Age was also facilitated by improving technology. Navigational techniques became more precise, making it harder for pirates to hide in remote locations. The ships of the Royal Navy became faster and more powerful. The bureaucracy of the British Empire became more efficient, allowing for better coordination between colonial governments and the Navy. The pirates, who were using relatively static technology and tactics, were simply outpaced by the rapid progress of the state they were fighting against. The pirate havens were not just bases, they were melting pots of outlaw culture. In places like Nassau, pirates from different ships and different backgrounds would mix, sharing stories, tactics, and information. It was here that the pirate culture was forged. They would drink together, gamble together, and fight together. These periods of shore leave were essential for building the social bonds and the shared identity that held the pirate world together. They were the chaotic, vibrant heart of the entire enterprise. The role of the quartermaster as a check on the captain's power is a fascinating example of early constitutional thinking. The pirates had essentially created a system with a separation of powers. The captain was the executive branch, with power during a crisis. The quartermaster was a combination of the legislative and judicial branches, representing the crew and administering justice. The entire crew, through their right to vote, was the ultimate sovereign power. It was a surprisingly sophisticated political system for a band of outlaws. Let's think about the sheer noise of a naval battle. The thunderous roar of dozens of cannons firing at once would have been deafening. The sound would echo across the water for miles. The air would be filled with the whistle of cannonballs, the crack of splintering wood, the screams of the wounded, and the shouts of men giving orders. It would have been a chaotic and terrifying sensory overload. To function in that environment required immense discipline and courage. The pirates' choice of targets was highly strategic. They were not just randomly attacking any ship they saw. They would use intelligence gathered in ports to learn about valuable ships and their schedules. They would focus on the soft targets, merchant vessels that were lightly armed and not expecting an attack. They tried to avoid a direct confrontation with a naval warship at all costs. Theirs was a strategy of asymmetric warfare, using speed and surprise to overcome their military and numerical inferiority. The legacy of piracy can be seen in our maritime law today. The concerted international effort to suppress piracy in the 18th century helped to establish the principle of universal jurisdiction over certain international crimes. The idea that pirates were hostis humani generis, enemies of all mankind, meant that any nation could capture and prosecute them, regardless of their nationality or where the crime was committed. This concept laid the groundwork for modern international law regarding crimes like genocide and terrorism. Ultimately, the story of the Golden Age of piracy is a story of failure. It was a rebellion that was crushed. It was a business model that was unsustainable. It was a lifestyle that led almost inevitably to an early death. The few who succeeded, like Henry Every, are remembered precisely because they were the rare exceptions. For the thousands of others, their story was one of misery, struggle, and defeat. The romantic myth is a tribute to our love of a good story, but it is a profound injustice to the men who actually lived and died in this brutal world. Let's reflect on the idea of the pirate utopia. Some historians have argued that a pirate ship was a unique form of social experiment, a floating proto-socialist society where wealth was distributed fairly, leaders were elected, and men of different races lived and worked together as equals. There is some truth to this. In many ways, a pirate ship was a more just and egalitarian society than the one on land. However, this utopia was built on a foundation of theft, violence, and terror. It was a society that could only sustain itself by preying on the outside world. It was a flawed and bloody paradise. The pirate's impact on popular culture is a testament to the power of a good villain. We are fascinated by figures who break the rules and live outside the bounds of conventional morality. The pirate is the ultimate outlaw, a figure of pure, untamed freedom. This is why he has endured in our stories for 300 years. He represents a part of the human psyche that dreams of casting off all constraints and living a life of pure, anarchic self-interest. He is a fantasy figure that allows us to explore the darker, more rebellious corners of our own imagination. Consider the role of maps. The classic treasure map, with an X marking the spot, is a fictional device. However, real pirates relied heavily on maps, not for finding treasure, but for navigation. These maps, called charts, were incredibly valuable and often closely guarded secrets. A good set of charts, showing coastlines, shoals, currents, and safe harbors, was a crucial tool for survival and success. The pirates would often steal charts from the ships they captured, as this was the primary way of expanding their operational knowledge of the seas. The economics of a pirate's life were precarious. Even after a successful haul, the money would disappear quickly. In port, prices for pirates were often inflated. Tavern keepers and merchants knew they had money to burn and would charge them exorbitant rates. A pirate's share from a prize, which seemed like a fortune at sea, could be spent in a matter of weeks on drink, gambling, and revelry. This forced them back to sea, broke and desperate, to begin the cycle all over again. They were trapped in a boom-and-bust economy of their own making. The relationship between pirates and slavers was complex. Pirates often attacked slave ships, but their target was usually the ship and its cargo of goods, not the enslaved people themselves. Managing a large number of captives was a logistical nightmare. However, some pirates did get involved in the slave trade, either by selling the captives they seized or by working with corrupt officials. The pirate world was not ideologically opposed to slavery. It was simply another business opportunity, and if it was profitable and practical, some pirates were willing to participate in this horrific trade. The physical and mental toll of a pirate's life would have aged a man prematurely. A 30-year-old pirate would likely look much older, his face lined from the sun and stress, his body scarred and worn down by hard labor and poor nutrition. The constant state of hypervigilance, the ever-present threat of violence, and the psychological weight of their crimes would have taken a heavy toll. These were not carefree adventurers. They were deeply stressed and often traumatized men living on the ragged edge of human endurance. The pirates' knowledge of the sea was intimate and profound. They could read the color of the water to detect shallows. They could interpret the patterns of the clouds to predict the weather. They understood the complex interplay of wind and currents. This was a form of folk science, passed down from one generation of sailors to the next. It was this deep, practical knowledge, not just their weapons, that made them such effective and dangerous mariners. Let's consider the women who were left behind. Many pirates were married or had families before they turned to a life of crime. Their decision to become a pirate meant abandoning their families, who would often face poverty and social disgrace. The story of piracy is usually told from the male perspective, but there was a hidden world of female suffering that was a direct consequence of their actions. The pirate's freedom was often bought at the expense of the women and children he left in his wake. The story of Blackbeard's final battle is a testament to the brutal reality of pirate combat. He was cornered by two ships commanded by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. Blackbeard's ship ran aground, and Maynard's men boarded. The fighting was incredibly fierce and personal. Blackbeard and Maynard allegedly fought each other directly. Blackbeard was a formidable figure, but he was eventually overwhelmed. The fact that he was shot 5 times and cut 20 times before he finally fell speaks to the sheer ferocity of these close-quarters battles. There was nothing elegant or choreographed about it. It was a desperate, bloody brawl to the death. The gibbeting of a pirate's body was the ultimate act of state propaganda. It was a visceral and horrifying display of the consequences of rebellion. The sight of a human body, rotting in a cage at the entrance to a harbor, would have been an unforgettable experience. It was a message that the state's power extended even beyond death. They could not only take your life, but they could desecrate your body and use it as a tool to terrorize others. It was the final and most brutal assertion of their authority. Let's think about the moral ambiguity of the Golden Age. The pirates were criminals, but they were often preying on ships that were part of the brutal and exploitative colonial system. A Spanish treasure galleon was carrying wealth that had been extracted from the forced labor of indigenous peoples in the silver mines of Potosi. A British slave ship was an instrument of unimaginable human suffering. In this context, were the pirates villains, or were they simply a different kind of predator in an ocean already full of them? This moral complexity is part of what makes the era so fascinating. The very concept of a golden age is a romantic invention. For the men living through it, it would not have felt golden at all. It would have felt desperate, dangerous, and uncertain. The name was applied later by historians, looking back and seeing this brief, intense period of piratical activity as a distinct and dramatic chapter in maritime history. The gold in the Golden Age refers to the wealth of stories and legends it produced, not to the quality of life for those who were part of it. The pirates' world was one of stark contrasts. They experienced moments of incredible wealth and power, followed by long periods of poverty and powerlessness. They lived in a system that was surprisingly democratic and egalitarian, yet sustained itself through brutal violence. They were surrounded by the stunning natural beauty of the tropics, but lived in conditions of unimaginable filth. It was a life of extreme highs and extreme lows, with very little in between. The end of piracy did not mean the end of hardship for sailors. The conditions in the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine remained brutal for many decades. The suppression of piracy was not about improving the lives of ordinary seamen. It was about protecting the profits of the powerful. In a way, the pirates' brief rebellion did nothing to change the underlying system that had created them. Once they were gone, the world of the common sailor went back to being one of exploitation and misery, but now without even the slim hope of a piratical escape. The stories of hidden pirate treasure, especially the tale of Captain Kidd, have fueled treasure hunters for centuries. Captain Kidd was a privateer who was later accused of piracy. He claimed to have buried a vast treasure and offered to reveal its location in exchange for his life. His offer was refused, and he was hanged. The legend of his lost treasure has persisted ever since, inspiring countless expeditions and cementing the idea of buried pirate gold in the public imagination. The fact that no major pirate treasure has ever been found has done little to diminish the power of the myth. The pirate's life was a constant gamble. Every decision was a calculated risk. Do we attack this ship, or is it too well armed? Do we trust this new crew member, or is he a spy? Do we sail into this storm or try to outrun it? The men who thrived in this environment were not just brutal fighters, they were shrewd risk managers. The most successful pirate captains were the ones who knew which gambles to take and which to avoid. But in the long run, the house always wins, and the house was the organized power of the state. Let's consider the simple act of looking at the horizon. For a pirate, this was not a passive or romantic activity. It was a matter of constant vigilance. The horizon was a source of both hope and fear. A smudge on the horizon could be a wealthy merchant ship, their next payday. Or it could be a Royal Navy frigate, their executioner. Every distant sail had to be identified and evaluated. The ability to distinguish a friend from a foe at a great distance was a critical survival skill. The horizon was the edge of their world, and it was fraught with both promise and peril. The social world of the pirates was intensely masculine. It was a world without women, without children, without the softening influences of family and domestic life. This constant, unmitigated masculinity would have shaped their culture, encouraging bravado, aggression, and a rough, often brutal form of camaraderie. The ship was a sealed container of pure testosterone, a factor that contributed to its volatility and its violent potential. The pirates' rebellion was ultimately a conservative one. They were not trying to overthrow the entire social order. They were trying to carve out a place for themselves within it, but on their own terms. They wanted the wealth and status that society denied them, but they were not revolutionaries with a political vision for a different world. Their goal was personal enrichment, not social transformation. This is why their rebellion was so easily crushed. It had no ideology to sustain it, beyond individual greed and a desire for revenge. And so, we are left with the ghost of the pirate, a figure that is part man, part myth. The historical reality is a sobering tale of human suffering and desperation. The legend is a thrilling adventure that speaks to our deepest desires for freedom. The true story lies in the vast, murky waters between the two. The brutal truth about being a pirate is that it was a terrible life. But it has produced one of the most enduring and powerful stories in our collective imagination. The very clothes on a pirate's back told a story of his life. A simple linen shirt might have been his original possession from his life as a merchant sailor. A fine silk waistcoat might have been stripped from a wealthy passenger on a captured vessel. A sturdy pair of canvas trousers might have been part of the ship's stores, distributed by the quartermaster. Their attire was a patchwork of their past and their crimes, a walking testament to their journey from an ordinary sailor to an outlaw of the sea. Let's consider the sounds of fear. The moment a merchant crew spotted the black flag being hoisted, a wave of panic would sweep the ship. You would hear the captain shouting desperate orders, the sailors scrambling in confusion, the passengers screaming in terror. To the pirates, these were the sounds of success. Their reputation was doing its work for them. The symphony of fear from the other ship was the prelude to their victory, a sign that the battle might be won before it had even begun. The pirates' knowledge of coastlines was encyclopedic. They knew the secret coves, the hidden channels, the sandbars that could trap an unwary naval pursuer. This intimate geographical knowledge was a form of defense. They could lead a heavier, deeper draft naval frigate on a chase through a maze of shallow waters, using their superior knowledge of the local terrain to make their escape. Their minds were living maps, full of the kind of detailed, practical information that could not be found on any official chart. The concept of a fair fight was completely alien to a pirate. Their entire philosophy was based on avoiding a fair fight at all costs. A fair fight meant that you had a reasonable chance of losing. A pirate's goal was to ensure that the odds were overwhelmingly stacked in his favor before any violence began. They achieved this through surprise, intimidation, superior numbers at the point of attack, and a willingness to be more ruthless than their opponents. Fairness was a luxury they could not afford. The loneliness of the sea must have been profound. Even on a crowded ship, a man could feel utterly alone. Surrounded by the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean, a man's personal troubles and fears could be magnified. There was no escape, no distraction, no one to turn to beyond the rough comfort of his crewmates. This deep, existential loneliness, combined with the constant threat of death, would have been a heavy psychological burden to bear. The pirates' use of language was often colorful and profane. Swearing was a common way to express frustration, to show bravado, and to bond with fellow crewmen. Their speech would have been a rich stew of sailors' jargon, regional dialects, and words borrowed from other languages they encountered in their travels. It would have been direct, forceful, and often brutally honest, a reflection of the world in which they lived. The elegant speech of fictional pirates is a far cry from the rough, practical language that would have been heard on a real pirate deck. Let's think about the moments of quiet beauty. Despite the hardship, there must have been times when a pirate could appreciate the stunning spectacle of his environment, a brilliant sunset over a calm sea, a clear night sky full of more stars than a city dweller could ever imagine, the sight of a pod of dolphins playing in the ship's bow wave. These moments of natural wonder would have been a stark contrast to the ugliness of their daily lives, a brief and poignant reminder of a world beyond their own violence and greed. The pirate's story is a powerful reminder that history is not just about kings and queens and generals. It is also about the anonymous, forgotten people who lived on the margins of society. The pirates were a footnote in the grand narrative of empires and nations, but their story gives us a glimpse into the brutal realities of life for the poor and the powerless in the 18th century. By studying them, we are not just learning about a band of thieves, we are learning about the world that created them. The final irony of the pirate's life is that he sought freedom, but found only a different kind of prison. He was a prisoner of the weather, a prisoner of his ship, a prisoner of his crew's democratic whims, a prisoner of his own reputation, and ultimately, a prisoner of the cycle of violence he could not escape. The dream of absolute freedom on the high seas was just that, a dream. The reality was a cage made of wood, water, and fear. So, the next time you think of a pirate, perhaps don't picture the swaggering hero of the movies. Picture instead a desperate man, his body weakened by disease and malnutrition, his mind scarred by violence and fear, standing on the deck of a filthy, stinking, overcrowded ship, staring at an empty horizon. That is the brutal truth of what it meant to be a pirate. And it is a truth far more compelling and far more human than any legend.